Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Kate O'Connell. Kate O'Connell is a child and family therapist with private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia, addressing the therapeutic needs of children, adolescents, adults, and families. Her training in intensive in-home services, addiction, family systems therapy, and energy medicine enables her to facilitate positive outcomes for her clients, all the while advocating for them within the legal, academic, medical, and social systems. She's a founder and director of the Healing Alliance of Central Virginia, a nonprofit organization offering a variety of efficacy-based modalities to facilitate mental, emotional, and physical healing at the cellular level for individuals of all ages and all walks of life, regardless of ability to pay. Her book, Beyond the Imprint, heralds a new paradigm of thinking within the field of mental health counseling, far beyond the duality of our unconscious condition. Quantum physics is beginning to replace the mechanistic world of Newtonian physics and is teaching us with every new discovery that we are intimately interconnected with our environment and everything in it. This includes the understanding that we can change what is outside of us by simply changing ourselves. Kate O'Connell, such an honor to have you on the show today, and thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Michael. I'm excited to talk about this work.
So I'm curious. There's been so many discoveries, within mind health, mental health counseling. Why did you feel that there was a void that needed to be filled? Why this new modality?
So it's a great question. I start by saying that as I was stitching it together, I had no idea that I was actually creating a new modality, a new treatment model within my field of mental health counseling. What I can tell you is, in all the work that I was doing postgraduate, when I first got out of graduate school in intensive in-home services, I started to notice that I had a really strong proclivity for noticing primarily what wasn't working. And at times I was kind of hard on myself because I thought, maybe it might benefit everybody if you had sort of a more optimistic outlook. But over time, I started to understand that somehow I was wired to do this because in doing so, I started to understand all the ways in which we are not having the right conversations. And in doing what I would refer to in a very big way as traditional therapeutic models of therapy, we're actually creating extremely codependent relationships with clients that have them relying on us for extended periods of time in order to feel better about themselves. And so what I did was, through lots of research and understanding what I was sitting with all the different presentations and all the different ages that were expressing different behavioral presentations, I started to understand that primarily in all traditional models of therapy, we were pretty much focused on the behaviors. And we pathologize them, and we have the DSM that lists all the criteria that justifies the pathologizing of these various presentations. But I started to actually understand that the behaviors accurately reflected the individual's experiences from the moment of birth. And that the behaviors always made perfect sense. And that if we primarily focused on the behaviors and then relied primarily, as we do in traditional models of therapy, with pharmacology to suppress the behaviors, then fundamentally nothing changes in the individual. And then I just started to play with these concepts and just look at them deeper and wider. And then numerous implications sort of grew out of that, which included the awareness that if you're doing what I do, i.e. Mental health counseling, then you need to be exhaustively working on yourself and being aware of what you're at the effect of as it relates to your own imprinting, because you're bringing that to the experience when you're sitting with clients and your stuff is always in the room. And so there's numerous sort of sub-theses to this modality. One of them is to teach therapists to become aware to the extent that there is an inherent power dynamic in the relationship between the therapist and the client. And once you're aware and conscious of that, to do your best to rebalance that in order to further empower the client, so that we're removing this old dualistic paradigm of the client relying on the expert. And what this modality does is it really reflects back to the client that they're the expert, and that all the therapist is really doing is steering the experience, because the client is essentially driving. So there's many ways to talk about it. That's kind of, I guess, a big intro to just give you some ideas, and then I'd be curious as to what you might be curious about, having heard what I just said.
So, yeah, because I know usually you have normal talk therapy where a person, sits and the patient just, talk about their behaviors, their experiences. And as a therapist, you're just there then to listen and then maybe kind of guide them along a little bit. But what you're saying then, that instead of then focusing on just symptom management, which is what in essence that is, and I see that a lot in the medical field as well. You have a pain somewhere, so then you use a pharmaceutical agent to suppress that pain. And as long as you're not experiencing symptoms, and you're considered being well. But in reality, it is then looking beyond the symptom and then, or the behavior in this case, and then seeing then what is some of the driving factors, what's the underlying factor, and recognizing, like you're saying, that we are not, you can't isolate the therapist from the patient. It becomes an experience that both of you have together. And obviously the patient knows more about their body subconsciously than the counselor does.
Yes, and we're all reflections of each other. That's a big theme, and there's no exception. Every single client that comes in is reflecting something back to me that I may be wanting to look at or not wanting to look at. And so there's always that thread running in the background. Mm-hmm. And so I think another thing that I'd like to identify in terms of how this works is in bringing in other fields in science, like the field of epigenetics, and all the research we have as it relates to trauma. What I've basically distilled down in this modality is the understanding that at the moment of conception, we inherit all of the memory from our respective DNA lineages. And that memory is encoded in the cells as we develop. And then once when we're in utero through gestation, we are absorbing sensations from that environment. And so at a very deep cellular level, we could be, depending on whether the environment is safe and secure or chaotic and stressful, we could be taking in at a very deep cellular level the awareness that it's not safe to be physical. So by the time we're born, we're already encoded at the cellular level, and then we have our experiences in our environment. And so what happens is to the degree that our needs were not met in a nurturing, responsive manner throughout the earliest critical stages of development, then as we grow through adolescence and into adulthood, we are showing up every day unconsciously looking outside of ourselves to get those needs met in a way that they weren't met by something or someone outside of us. And so that is basically the understanding of how this treatment model works, is first to identify that this, in fact, is happening for all of us, and that this memory that we're holding on to is quite real, and that stimulus in the environment, when it shows up, will activate that memory, take us right to that survival place, and then we become reactive, we become defensive, and on and on and on. And so the one thing that we don't want to be doing, and we certainly don't want to be doing it with individuals starting at a very young age, is medicating whatever our reactivity might be to the stimulus in the environment. So if I have a kid or if I have an adolescent who is struggling and who isn't showing up according to the expectations in the environment, then all I want to look at is what's going on in the environment, because every child has an innate desire and proclivity to be successful, from the true sense of what that means, which is to fit in, to belong, to be accepted, to thrive. And if a child and an adolescent isn't doing that, then it isn't because there's some inherent flaw in that child or adolescent. It's because something is happening in the environment that is not meeting their needs in a way that would be appropriate. And so one of the big pieces of this modality, and it's part of the mission statement of the Healing Alliance, which I created because I started to understand this modality is so much bigger than me, one practitioner, is that I want to get all these kids off their meds, because the statistics and the trend to be doing this now, it's gotten to the point where the pharmaceutical companies, their marketing campaign is actually creating these disease models that are being included in the DSM. And in my book, you'll read there all the specifics about all the congressional hearings that are going on, and the fact that all the psychiatrists that contributed into the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 had significant financial dealings with the pharmaceutical companies. So it's an incredibly corrupt model of healthcare.
It doesn't surprise me one bit. We're going to take a quick break. I'm really fascinated to chat a little bit more, ask a few questions about what you just mentioned. Yes. We'll be right back. You're listening to Health Made Radio, and I'm here with Kate O'Connell. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I'm here with Kate O'Connell. She's a child and family therapist, also the author of the book Beyond the Imprint. So something that struck me, you were talking about all the imprint that took place before a child was born. So you have, because most of us would think that our experience starts at childbirth, or maybe even almost a little bit beyond that, as far back as we can remember. So it's almost like you have this neutral being that is just evolving, but the emotional imprint does not take place until they are more conscious. But in reality, in utero, they're extremely conscious, and then you're saying that even the genetic material that comes from their father, from their mother, and whatever traumas that have impacted that genetic material gets imprinted into this child, so that becomes the foundation of this child, how this child views the world.
Yes. And it will, and that part of it actually is what informs intergenerational patterns, which are very real, where you will see, and it can be as abstract and as concrete. So it could actually be, we're talking about what genetically we're vulnerable to manifest as a dis-ease expression, mental, emotional, physical, when we reach a tipping point because of chronic stress or trauma in the environments that we grow up in. And we could also be talking about things as in terms of musical aptitude, and they've done studies where people who have been separated from biological parents, children, and raised in different families, we know that they end up having very similar experiences in the things that they like, that they dislike, what they actually choose to do as professions, who they end up marrying. It's really quite fascinating. I've had experiences in the work that I've done in which when I'm working with, say, a 12-year-old girl who's had chronic sexual abuse experiences, then I know, and I've learned over many years, that you can pretty much count on that her mother has, and grandmother has, and great-grandmother has. So these intergenerational patterns are passed down, and they touch on so many aspects of us in terms of, that includes even experiences that we attract to ourselves, and not just physical traits, and not just predispositions to manifesting particular diseases or illnesses, but even in terms of how we respond in terms of our nervous system to chronic stress and trauma. I had an experience personally where when I met my husband, who had had significant trauma growing up, I was aware that he had a tremor in his hand, and it was quite noticeable. And it was when my mother met him that she actually shared the story with me that when she met my father, because he had had some significant trauma just prior to her meeting him, almost the same amount of months as my husband had prior to me meeting him, and that when my mother met my father, he also had a permanent tremor in his hand. So it can be things that are very nuanced and, that almost feel like they're surreal and it can't be true and they can't possibly be connected. But there's many ways in which memory is passed down, and it doesn't necessarily dictate that needs to be our experience, but I would contend that the more aware we become of what it is we're unconsciously at the effect of, the more empowered we become to consciously change that experience. And
it just kind of then also points to how important it is then for an individual, for a mother and father, to work on their emotional well-being prior to giving birth to a child, because if you can then change that emotional mental imprint, you will really set that child, set them up for a much more successful life emotionally.
Yes. And the one thing we want to be aware of as parents is to acknowledge that we are always unconsciously parenting through our own unresolved imprinting. And then how that plays out is, for father, relative to raising son, when the son reaches certain ages, the son could, at a very deeply unconscious level, from the father's perspective, be reflecting back things to the father that the father is not comfortable connecting to as it relates to his own trauma memory, as well as mother relative to daughter. Essentially, as the daughter's growing, for example, an 8-year-old daughter would be reflecting back to mother unconsciously any experiences that the mother is holding on to that are unresolved at the cellular level when she was that age. And so you want to become that aware of what it is that you're bringing to the experience of parenting your children and how that shows up is control mechanisms. So the parents will unconsciously respond by attempting to control the child's behaviors in order to ensure the safety of the child. And it's always coming from unresolved stuff within the parent, in which, at a very deep unconscious level, that sense of trauma, overwhelm response that was happening at the physiological level at that same age had them feeling overwhelmed, and perhaps that their survival was hanging in the balance. So whenever I have parents who tend to be somewhat controlling in terms of how regimented and rule-oriented they are, we will just open all of this up in order to help them become aware of where the fears are coming from. They aren't rational to the extent that the child has demonstrated any real reason to want to curtail his movements or her movements to the extent that they are trying to or want to. It has to do with what was happening with them at that age that had them feeling incredibly unsafe.
So it's almost like then a kind of subconscious contract between the parent and the child, where the child is assisting the parent in becoming aware of the wound, the traumas that the parent is still holding, and then projecting that towards the parent, but then the parent then afraid to look at that, and then trying to control the child just like they're controlling the emotion within and suppressing it.
Yes, and often I will get my children that I work with brought in by a parent where the general story and the general perception is, if you fix Johnny, then we're going to be fine. And by the end of the session, after listening to their narrative, I let them know that it might be best if they leave Johnny at home and have them work with me, because if they change, then Johnny changes.
Yeah, because if they resolve their traumas, or whatever it is, and it could have been multi-generational, like you've talked about, whenever they resolve that, then the child does not need to project it anymore.
Correct.
Wonderful. And how we deal with these kind of situations, then as a modern society, is that we want to suppress then these kind of behaviors, and then we use medications, which obviously just complicate and make these kind of traumas more complex, and then they start to then become then physiological manifestations along with the mental, emotional.
Correct.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So
it is.
So in your book, then, Beyond the Imprint, is this what, in essence, what you are talking about? How these kind of genetic imprints and emotional imprints, how they then impact our emotional and mental well-being?
So in the book Beyond the Imprint, what I've done is I've included anything that I think is relevant for someone who does what I do to read. So I touch on the shadow self, the shadow material, which is just another term for what we're holding on to unconsciously and what we defend against. I have a chapter in there called The Dance of Relationship, in which I talk about the fact that the majority of relationships are codependent because we are unconsciously showing up as adults, needing the other person to show up a certain way in order for us to be okay, because we're unconsciously attempting to get our needs met in a way that they weren't met by our primary caregivers. I talk about what needs to be happening with the therapist and how to find a good therapist, and that you don't want to be working with somebody for 20 years because that's evidence of the fact that nothing's really happening if the person has to see you every week for 20 years, that all you're doing is creating a codependent relationship with the client where they get to come in and tell their victimology story. So all these narratives tend to have a victimology orientation to it, and there are no victims and perpetrators within this modalities. There's just the understanding that everybody at any given moment is showing up doing their best given what they know in the moment to be true. So, one of the things I tell people is we all have a tendency to do postmortems on our lives at any given point. We go back in time and we judge ourselves for what the choices were that we made 10 years ago. And my position on that is, if you're doing that, and if your choices from 6 years ago or 6 months ago make you cringe, that's actually something to celebrate, because that means that you are healing and you are developing and you are evolving to increase awareness. And so you will look back and wonder what you were thinking. All you want to know is that in that given moment, it all made perfect sense. And 6 months from now, you're going to be judging what choices you make today. And that's the process. And so rather than judge it, just celebrate the fact that you are actually changing. You're an organism, you're healing, you're changing, you're evolving, your frequency is increasing. And, that's all that we can really ask of ourselves to do.
Wonderful. That's a much better mindset. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm here with Kate O'Connell, child and family therapist, and we're talking about Beyond the Imprint. So when you're looking at then you're talking about the shadow self. I mean, that's a term that I've heard a lot, but what does that mean?
So the shadow material, Carl Jung brought that to our awareness. It is all of the self-loathing, shame imprinting, self-negation, limiting beliefs about the self, perceptions about the self that are extremely negative and judgmental, all the things that we desperately defend against and hide. Our greatest fear would be that someone would get a peek at that, and then they'd be repulsed by what they see. So the shadow material within this modality is the imprinting. It's the pieces of us that have split off in response to traumatic, chronically stressful, overwhelming experiences that at the time that we experience, we're literally flash frozen in the frequency of fear at a particular time in space. And those are very real. In the shamanic realm, when you go to a shaman for a soul retrieval, those pieces that are coming back are those pieces, those aspects of us that have split off in response to traumatic, overwhelming events. And they don't need to meet the level and the criteria of catastrophic. When you're 3 years old, what's overwhelming could seem pretty unremarkable to an adult sitting in the room, because there's such acute sensitivity in the physiological, emotional body of a 3-year-old. So it doesn't take a whole lot of a negative stimulus to overwhelm a 3-year-old. And so what we do essentially when we're healing and dissolving these imprints is we're integrating these aspects that have split off. And the term I like to use is helping the individual come into greater alignment with themselves. And so these aspects that are split off would be material that would be identified as the shadow material. The parts of us that have split off, that we judge, that we negate, that we are essentially split off from. And so when we integrate these pieces, we come into greater alignment with ourselves. And it's not something that we've created any linear tools to measure. What I'm describing now kind of hangs out more in the realm of energy medicine, which is primarily where I hang out in the work that I do. And it's very real. And so I can sense to the extent that somebody is out of alignment with themselves. And so a big part of how to teach people about noticing that for themselves is connecting them to their bodies, because that is chronically what ends up happening in response to these overwhelming traumatic experiences throughout the course of a lifetime, is we become fundamentally disconnected from the body. We are a culture, and we have been for many, many hundreds of years, that is primarily mentally oriented. The Age of Reason, I write about that in the book. And we think we feel, that's our tendency as a culture, rather than actually feel. And the body is constantly sending us signals, letting us know exactly how we feel about what's happening. And so a big part of what we do in the work with this modality is help people get back into their bodies, get grounded in their bodies, so they can actually experience themselves in their bodies, even though it might be painful and uncomfortable initially, and then teach them how to listen to the body and how to receive the signals. Because, one of the primary diagnoses that starts to show up in a very young child these days is anxiety disorder. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are the biggest medications that children are being prescribed these days, as young as 3 years old. And if you have an anxiety disorder, that's the other thing that kind of fascinates me, is in the 9 years that I've been in private practice, actually coming up on 10, what I started to learn, because I was asking this question of everyone, is when your doctor diagnoses you with an anxiety disorder, do they tell you what anxiety is? Nobody has a clue what anxiety is. Nobody's ever been told what anxiety is when they've been diagnosed with having an anxiety disorder and prescribed medication for it. So, we start at that, what would to me seems like a pretty elementary place to begin, which is helping the client understand what it is that their body is actually responding to. So if you have a childhood in which you have for example, a raging alcoholic father, and you never know what's going to happen next because your environment is very scary and very chaotic, then what happens is your nervous system is chronically on in survival mode, and your adrenals are chronically activated, and you're chronically tuned in and oriented to the future of what hasn't happened yet, in an attempt to survive what hasn't happened yet, because you're always waiting for the next major, scary, catastrophic, crisis-oriented thing to happen. And so what happens in the nervous system and how it works, and you probably have a lot of experience with this given what you do, is that all becomes exhausted and adrenal fatigue, which means at that point it takes very little stimulus in the environment to activate the adrenals. And it interrupts sleep, it interrupts the ability to function during the day, it interrupts your ability to be focused on the task at hand, which for children is sitting still for 6.5 hours in the course of the day and focusing on material that for the most part is irrelevant to them. And it's in this environment, in the academic environment, that they're actually identified as in the need to be medicated. And even though that's illegal, it is still happening. So, kids are not being identified with anxiety disorders in their home environment. It's about how they're not showing up in the academic environment that ends up making them vulnerable for these diagnoses.
So is this how you would describe anxiety disorder? I mean, that stemming from childhood experiences that way and traumas that way? I mean,
absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it. It's just chronically being in fear of what hasn't happened. And it's at such a deep level of survival that, and again, keeping in mind, because people say, oh, I didn't have that kind of childhood. Well, the thing is when you're 2 and when you're 3 and when you're 4, and because your brain is not fully developed, and the limbic brain is the first part of the brain to develop, which just takes in sensations. And it takes you 25 years to develop the prefrontal cortex completely, which is where you process. That's what's considered the executive judgment part of the brain, where you make you have rational thought processes around what's happening. But when you're very young, all you're doing is just a sponge. You're being a sponge absorbing what's happening in the environment. And so if you have this experience of feeling chronically unsafe, I worked with a client. I didn't start working with her until she was in her 40s, but her father was so scary that she would have frequent experiences of being catatonic as a child, just completely paralyzed. And so, but if you had asked her from the first time you sat with her, that wasn't her story. That's the other thing that's really interesting that I talk about with this modality is that why it's not helpful to have a client come in and tell you their story over and over and over again is your story is not an accurate representation of what you actually experience. The mind is our biggest defense mechanism, and the stories we make up about what we've experienced are actually unconsciously designed to distance ourselves from what we actually experience.
So they're part of the defense mechanism then?
Correct.
Yeah. Well,
Correct.
we're gonna take a quick welcome back to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I am here with Kate O'Connell, author of Beyond the Imprint. So one point that was really fascinating, you're talking about the story being our defense mechanism, that we create a story that sounds better or maybe worse sometimes even than what it is, but just to hide what truly is lying underneath. But you truly, because a lot of us, like you said, we said, well, my childhood was pretty good. I mean, I have no reason to deal with these anxieties or feel depressed or whatever it is that we're dealing with. But like you're mentioning, a 3-year-old is experiencing life quite differently than we would do with our conscious brain, more developed brain. So it can then be, the anxiety can be something that as an adult, when we look back at it, it doesn't look that bad or scary. But as a 3-year-old, it could have been a big deal. And the importance then of being able to address that and resolve that, even though looking back at it, it doesn't look that big.
Right. And the body giving you the signals as being represented in something that would meet the criteria for an anxiety disorder is giving you all the information you need to know. It's like if you have gotten to a place in your life in which you're vibrating with a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety in response to stimulus showing up in your environment that would not appear remarkable to others, then all that tells you is you've been deeply imprinted throughout life that would suggest to you on a regular basis that you did not feel safe. And we don't need, this is the other thing that is so refreshing about this modality, is we don't need to go in and find every minute detail about everything you ever experienced and revisit it under a microscope. We don't need to do that.
So how does this modality then deal with these traumas that we may or may not be aware of?
So that's where the energy work comes in.
And energy work, I mean, in what way?
So you've heard of healing touch, you've heard of Reiki. There's different systems of energy work.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so one of the things that I've done with the Healing Alliance is I've identified that there's going to be various modalities that would fall under the heading of energy medicine. So traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, massage therapy, craniosacral therapy, neurokinetic therapy, Watsu, and on and on and on. And what I've done is, because of all of my training in energy work, I lived and studied for 5 years up in the Adirondacks with a Cherokee medicine woman. So I received training through that lineage, if you will, in terms of energy medicine and how to channel energy. And I'm also a Reiki master, and I've had multiple teachers representing multiple different wisdom teachings on the planet. And what I started to come to understand is at some point in my own personal evolution in facilitating healing for the other, I understood that essentially I'm just a synthesis of every transmission I've ever received, because when you're studying these different models of energy medicine, all we're doing is we're receiving energetic transmissions. They're just unique unto the lineage that's passed these down. And so when I started to understand that, then I just gave myself permission to just be the synthesis of everything I have ever received as a transmission that allows me then to become a channel to facilitate healing at the energetic level. And what I can tell you is I've created a specific energy technique that is used specific to this modality to heal at the cellular level. And it came through with a lot of meditation, a lot of guidance. And as a result of that, people who are working with me are having very accelerated healing experiences, to the point where I tell people if they come to see me once a week for 8 weeks, then their life will have significantly changed. And at that point, they can feel like they've made enough of a change, or they might want to continue. But under no circumstances do I want to look up in 2 years and see this person in my office. That's how accelerated the healing can be. And so in a very short period of time, people will feel very differently in their body, and then how they create their life around that will also look different. And it's quite remarkable. There's no one who's more in awe of this modality and what its implications are than I am, because I've had the benefit of seeing it unfold over a period of almost 10 years with the collective that has unfolded in my practice, which is why I'm now stepping out in the community and making bold statements. And one of them is a true statement. It is bold. It gets a lot of attention. Not all of it's positive. Is that every single child and adolescent who has come to see me in the last 10 years who was on medication went off it quickly and functioned much better as a result of it.
That's amazing.
And that's how I know, and that's how I know it works. I never would be making such sweeping, bold statements about the efficacy of this modality if it wasn't showing itself to be true with every person that came in here every single day. It's just incredible.
Because we know the medication they're on is going to inhibit their mental and emotional development for the rest of their life.
Correct. And it changes the brain. And energetically, when I'm working with somebody, what I tell them is, look, it's like I have to work through more layers to get to the imprinting. And so everybody that comes in here, this is the other interesting thing, is when you start to name this stuff, wow, do people respond. They don't want to be on meds. They just, like when you tell them that they can actually get off their meds and function better, then you've really got their attention. They're extremely motivated, and they're starting now to feel extremely empowered and to take ownership for their own healing and to become their own expert, where, again, all I do is I steer. It's entirely up to them how fast we go, how slow we go. I don't determine that. They determine all of it.
That's amazing. Well, Kate, it's been such an honor to have you on the show, and I really urge all the listeners to get her book, the Beyond the Imprint, because I would say we see people dealing with all these chronic health conditions, and one of the main drivers are these kind of genetic, emotional, mental imprints, and to be able to address them in a very efficacious way, that that it's more important than anything. So thank you so much, Kate, for being on the show with us today.
And thanks so much for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
I can tell. I can tell.
Oh, can I also just throw out a little tease?
Absolutely,
the first
please.
book, the Beyond the Imprint, is the first of 3. And so the second one is Getting Beyond the Imprint, which is the didactic manual that actually takes you through it. And then the third one is called Freedom Beyond the Imprint, which is the spiritual framework So you can go as wide with this as you want.
I love it.
It's amazing. Karma is not a bitch. That's the first chapter in that book. It's actually memory. That's all karma is. It's neutral. It's just memory. So it's the memory we've also brought in from other lifetimes that sets us up and determines that we're going to be imprinted in the way that we are because it's familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited. You have that was all for today. If you're listening to HealthMade Radio, remember check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.